There was a queen so beautiful she seduced kings, and so evil her name became synonymous with wickedness for 3,000 years. For 22 years, Jezebel turned Israel into a slaughterhouse of faith, importing 450 priests of Baal while orchestrating the murder of 850 prophets in cold blood. She weaponized beauty and political power to systematically destroy an entire nation's relationship with God. But here's what will shock you about this royal monster. Her downfall wasn't orchestrated by armies. It was prophesied by a man she thought she had silenced forever. This woman was an absolute demon in royal robes. But before you judge this monster completely, let's see how this story truly began. Picture the ancient Mediterranean coast, where purple-dyed ships cut through azure waters, carrying precious cargo between mighty cities. This was Phoenicia, a civilization built on commerce, conquest, and the worship of gods who demanded blood. The Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon rose from the Mediterranean shores like jeweled crowns. These weren't just trading posts. They were centers of power that controlled sea routes stretching from Egypt to Spain. Phoenician merchants didn't just trade goods, they traded influence, culture, and religion. Their ships carried more than purple cloth and precious metals. They carried the worship of Baal. Imagine walking through a Phoenician temple. The air thick with incense and the metallic scent of blood. Stone and wooden idols lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow visitors through the shadows. These weren't gentle household gods. Baal controlled storms and fertility. Life and death hung in his hands. Astarte represented love twisted with warfare, passion merged with violence. Daily rituals fed these hungry deities. Priests chanted, animals died, blood flowed. In this world of divine brutality and political ambition, one priest watched and waited. Baal served in Baal's temple in Tyre, but service wasn't enough. Picture him moving through the temple corridors, his priestly robes concealing the heart of a predator. He studied the current king, cataloging every weakness, every moment of vulnerability. Other priests saw religious duty. Baal saw opportunity. 1 Kings 16:31 records the stark truth. And it came to pass, as if it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. King of the Sidonians. Read that again. Ethbaal didn't inherit his throne. He took it. The conspiracy unfolded in whispered conversations and midnight meetings. Ethbaal gathered allies among fellow priests who craved power beyond temple walls. Palace guards who could be bought, court officials who saw which way the wind was blowing. This wasn't a moment of passion. This was calculated murder planned in the shadow of pagan altars. Think about that banquet. The king relaxed among trusted friends, wine flowing, laughter echoing through the palace halls. He had no idea that his most trusted priest had become his executioner. When the poisoned dagger found its mark, it wasn't just regicide. It was a blood offering to Baal, sealing Ethbaal's pact with the forces of darkness. Ethbaal seized the throne immediately. No succession crisis, no civil war, just swift, brutal efficiency. The priest had become king, and the kingdom became an altar. He didn't just maintain the existing temples, he expanded them. New altars rose throughout the land. More priests gained influence in his court. The worship of Baal intensified under his rule, like fire fed with oil. Into this world of ritual violence and political murder, Jezebel was born. Picture the royal palace in Sidon, where baby Jezebel drew her first breath. The walls decorated with images of Baal and Astarte, incense burning constantly, priests moving through the corridors like shadows, their robes rustling with dark purpose. This princess didn't grow up with lullabies. She grew up with chants to bloodthirsty gods. From the moment she could walk, Jezebel watched animal sacrifices as casually as other children watched butterflies. The sight of blood on altar stones was as normal to her as sunlight. Her tutors didn't just teach her to read and write. They indoctrinated her in Phoenician theology. Baal controlled the destiny of nations. Astarte blessed those who pleased her with victory in love and war. The gods demanded absolute devotion, and they rewarded it with absolute power. Baal recognized something dangerous in his daughter's intelligence. She absorbed political lessons by watching his court sessions, understanding how power flowed through carefully orchestrated negotiations. She learned trade secrets, shipping routes, commercial agreements, the intricate web of relationships that kept Phoenician wealth flowing. Most importantly, she learned to interpret omens and dreams, to speak with the authority of divine revelation. Think about what this meant. Jezebel didn't just believe in Baal's power, she believed she could channel it. She saw herself as his earthly representative, equipped to bend nations to her will through beauty, intelligence, and spiritual authority. The royal family's religious life was a constant festival of paganism. They participated in ritual dances where worshippers moved to hypnotic rhythms, their bodies swaying in ecstatic worship. They offered expensive gifts to temple idols, pouring wine and oil over carved stone faces. These weren't weekly religious obligations, they were daily demonstrations of devotion to gods who promised earthly dominance in exchange for spiritual submission. As Jezebel grew older, she began participating directly in temple rituals alongside the priests. Her father watched with approval as she learned the sacred mysteries, the secret knowledge that separated rulers from subjects. She was being prepared for something beyond ordinary royal marriage. Baal was crafting a weapon, beautiful, intelligent, and absolutely committed to the supremacy of Baal. Picture this princess in her teenage years, moving through the palace with the confidence of someone who believed the gods had destined her for greatness. She had watched her father seize a throne through violence and seen him rewarded with prosperity. She had learned that the strong take what they want and the weak serve the strong. Most dangerously, she had learned that religious authority could justify any action, no matter how brutal. Her father prepared her for future negotiations, teaching her to use beauty and intelligence as weapons in political warfare. But this wasn't just diplomatic training. This was preparation for conquest. Jezebel was being shaped into an agent of Phoenician religion, ready to carry Baal's worship wherever marriage or politics might take her. The stage was set. The weapon was forged. All that remained was finding the right target. Her father prepared her to use beauty and intelligence in future negotiations. The Palace of Sidon became Jezebel's finishing school for power, where every corridor taught lessons in manipulation and every feast demonstrated the art of influence. Picture this royal residence: marble floors polished to mirror brightness, walls adorned with precious metals, and ivory carvings depicting Baal's victories over rival gods. Servants moved through these halls like shadows, attending to every whim of the princess, who would one day export Phoenician darkness to foreign lands. Jezebel observed her father Baal ruling with an iron fist wrapped in silk diplomacy. She watched him receive foreign dignitaries with lavish hospitality while extracting maximum advantage from every agreement. She studied how he used fear and generosity as twin tools of statecraft. When he smiled, treaties were signed. When he frowned, armies marched. This was the education of a future queen, not in embroidery or poetry, but in the ruthless mathematics of power. Her tutors taught her the languages of commerce: Egyptian for dealing with southern traders, Assyrian for northern negotiations, Hebrew for the mountain kingdoms inland. She spoke each tongue with the fluency of a native, understanding that language was the key that unlocked the treasures of foreign nations. But these weren't just communication skills, they were weapons of cultural conquest. Every phrase she mastered was another tool for bending foreign minds to her will. The ancient histories of Tyre and Sidon filled her mind with tales of Phoenician supremacy. She learned how her ancestors had planted colonies across the Mediterranean, carrying Baal's worship to distant shores. She discovered that trade routes were missionary paths, that every commercial agreement was an opportunity to spread religious influence. Commerce and conquest walked hand in hand through the pages of her education. Jezebel didn't just attend royal council meetings, she participated in them with increasing authority. Picture this teenage princess sitting beside her father's throne, offering insights that impressed seasoned diplomats. She suggested alternative trade routes when political tensions threatened established paths. She identified weaknesses in rival kingdoms that could be exploited through careful negotiation. Her mind absorbed information like a sponge and processed it like a calculating machine designed for domination. Most remarkably, she gained reputation as an interpreter of divine will. When merchants sought favorable omens before launching expeditions, they consulted Jezebel. She read flight patterns of birds, claiming to discern Baal's blessing or warning. She studied star positions, declaring when Astarte smiled upon romantic or military ventures. Think about what this meant. A young woman wielding religious authority in a culture that revered spiritual power above all earthly influence. She was becoming a bridge between the divine and political realms. The people of Sidon adored their beautiful princess. They saw her quick intelligence and gracious manner, not understanding the calculating mind beneath the charming exterior. She moved through the city streets, distributing gifts and kind words, building a network of personal loyalty that transcended her royal status. Every smile was an investment. Every gesture of kindness was a deposit in a political bank account she would later cash with devastating interest. Jezebel negotiated cedar wood prices with foreign merchants, displaying an instinctive understanding of market dynamics that amazed experienced traders. She knew when to drive hard bargains and when to offer generous terms that built long-term relationships. She understood that today's small concession could become tomorrow's massive advantage. Her reputation spread among trading circles as a fair but shrewd negotiator who never forgot a favor or an insult. The palace festivals she organized became legendary throughout Phoenicia. Musicians and dancers performed intricate ceremonies honoring Baal and Astarte. These weren't mere entertainments, they were religious propaganda designed to reinforce the supremacy of Phoenician gods. Wine flowed like rivers. Exotic foods from distant lands filled golden platters. Guests left these celebrations convinced that Sidon's deities were more powerful than their own, carrying that conviction back to their homelands like a spiritual virus. Even her royal siblings recognized Jezebel as the natural leader among Etbaal's children. They deferred to her judgment in family matters and sought her advice on personal decisions. She possessed that indefinable quality that draws followers, charisma backed by competence, beauty enhanced by intelligence, spiritual authority validated by political success. Etbaal praised his daughter's devotion to Baal and Astarte, not knowing he was creating a monster. She visited temples daily, offering expensive incense and personal prayers. But she also learned secret rituals previously reserved for ordained priests. She memorized incantations that could supposedly influence weather patterns. She mastered ceremonial procedures that claimed to channel divine power through human vessels. She was becoming more than a royal worshipper. She was transforming into a priestess with political power. Merchants brought news from distant kingdoms, and Jezebel listened carefully to every report about political upheavals, military movements, and religious controversies. She learned about internal conflicts in neighboring nations, about harvest failures and succession disputes, about trade opportunities and military threats. Information was power, and she hoarded it like precious gems in preparation for future conquests. Then one day, Opportunity arrived wearing royal robes and speaking Hebrew. King Ahab of Israel came to Sidon with a substantial entourage of advisors and armed guards. The negotiations between Etbaal and Ahab continued in the main hall of the palace, where tapestries depicting Phoenician conquests adorned the walls and golden vessels caught the light from oil lamps. These weren't casual trade discussions, they were the careful dance of two kingdoms probing each other's strengths and needs. Picture the scene. Ahab sat across from Etbaal at a table laden with the finest foods Sidon could offer: dates stuffed with almonds, wine aged in cedar casks, bread baked with honey and spices from distant lands. But the real feast was information, and both kings consumed it hungrily. They agreed to exchange Israel's abundant grain harvests for Phoenicia's prized wines and olive oils. The mathematics of mutual prosperity played out in careful calculations. Ahab explained that Israel's fertile valleys produced grain surpluses that could feed Phoenician cities and trading fleets. The Jordan River Valley yielded wheat and barley in quantities that exceeded domestic needs. Etbaal listened with the attention of a merchant who recognized opportunity when it presented itself. Phoenician ships could carry Israeli grain to hungry markets across the Mediterranean, generating profits for both kingdoms. But Etbaal had larger concerns than grain shipments. He spoke carefully about the need for strong alliances against common enemies. The Assyrians threatened from the north with their iron weapons and ruthless military efficiency. Syrian armies raided border territories. Egyptian influence still reached into Canaan through political manipulation and military pressure. Neither kingdom could stand alone against such threats. Jezebel listened to every word from her position beside her father's throne. She watched Ahab's facial expressions, noting when his eyes brightened with interest and when they clouded with concern. She studied his advisors, cataloging which ones leaned forward during discussions of military alliance and which ones shifted uncomfortably when religious differences were mentioned. This was intelligence gathering disguised as royal etiquette. Then Etbaal dropped his bombshell with the casual precision of a master strategist. He proposed marriage between Jezebel and Ahab to seal an eternal alliance between their kingdoms. The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through both royal entourages. Ahab's surprise was visible. His cup paused halfway to his lips. His eyes widened slightly before he recovered his diplomatic composure. Think about what this meant. Marriage wasn't romance in royal circles. It was politics written in wedding contracts. Etbaal was offering his daughter as a human bridge between two kingdoms, a living treaty that couldn't be broken by changing political winds. Jezebel would become both queen and ambassador, carrying Phoenician interests into the heart of Israel. Jezebel smiled when she heard her father's proposal. Not the shy smile of a maiden surprised by matrimonial arrangements, but the satisfied smile of someone whose deepest ambitions had just received royal endorsement. She had been prepared for this moment through years of education and observation. Now, the moment had arrived. Ahab requested time to deliberate with his advisors, a reasonable response that demonstrated diplomatic wisdom. Behind closed doors, the Israeli delegation debated furiously. Some advisors focused on economic benefits, calculating the wealth that would flow from Phoenician trade partnerships. Cedar wood for construction projects, purple dye for royal garments. Access to Mediterranean shipping routes that could make Israel a commercial hub. Other advisors raised concerns about religious differences. Israel worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Phoenicia served Baal and Astarte with rituals that included practices forbidden by Israeli law. How could these conflicting religious systems coexist in a royal marriage? Would Jezebel demand temples for her gods in Israeli cities? But Ahab had already made his decision. The alliance promised too many advantages to sacrifice on the altar of religious purity, economic prosperity, military security, political influence that could elevate Israel among Mediterranean powers. He decided the benefits outweighed the risks. The next day, Ahab accepted the marriage proposal. Baal announced the decision to his entire court with theatrical joy, but his satisfaction ran deeper than performance. He had just secured a pathway for Phoenician influence into Israeli territory through the most intimate possible connection, royal marriage. Jezebel was formally presented to Ahab as his future wife in ceremonies that mixed diplomatic protocol with religious blessing. They walked through the palace gardens, where exotic flowers bloomed in carefully maintained beds and fountains provided musical accompaniment to their private conversation. In those garden pathways, Jezebel revealed her true intentions with startling boldness. She expressed her desire to co-rule Israel alongside Ahab, not merely serve as a decorative royal consort. She spoke about bringing Phoenician altars to Israeli territory, establishing worship centers for Baal and Astarte in the heart of the Promised Land. These weren't requests, they were requirements disguised as suggestions. Ahab listened with growing fascination to Jezebel's ideas about shared power and religious expansion. She promised to bring not just political alliance, but spiritual protection from her powerful gods. Baal would ensure abundant rains for Israeli crops. Astarte would bless their marriage with fertility and their armies with victory. The gods who had made Phoenicia prosperous could do the same for Israel. Most remarkably, Ahab agreed to permit Phoenician worship in Samaria after their marriage. The decision sealed more than a political alliance. It opened the door for spiritual conquest that would poison Israel for generations. They planned the wedding ceremony details during their private garden conversations, mixing Israeli traditions with Phoenician rituals in a union that would horrify the faithful and delight the enemies of God. Ahab's caravan prepared for the return journey to Israel with their precious and dangerous cargo. Picture the preparations: dozens of servants loading wagons with wedding gifts, diplomatic treasures, and the personal belongings that would establish Jezebel's household in a foreign land. She brought loyal Phoenician servants who would serve as her eyes and ears in Israeli territory. These weren't just domestic workers, they were cultural missionaries trained to advance Phoenician interests through daily service. Jezebel's treasure chests contained more than gold and jewels. Hidden among legitimate wedding gifts were small idols of Baal and Astarte, ritual implements for pagan worship, and sacred scrolls containing Phoenician religious instructions. She was smuggling an entire religious system into Israel, disguised as royal dowry. The journey from Sidon to Samaria followed coastal roads that wound through Phoenician villages and trading posts. For several days, Jezebel traveled through familiar territory where people spoke her language and worshipped her gods. But with each mile southward, the landscape changed. Phoenician settlements gave way to Hebrew communities. Palm trees yielded to olive groves. The Mediterranean's influence faded as they approached the hill country of central Israel. Ahab entertained Jezebel during the long travel days with stories of Samaria's grandeur. He described the palace he was building, the fertile valleys that produced abundant harvests, the strategic location that controlled trade routes between Egypt and Damascus. He painted pictures of prosperity and power that matched Jezebel's ambitions perfectly. When they crossed the border into Israeli territory, armed guards surrounded the royal caravan. These weren't just ceremonial escorts, they were protection against bandits and political enemies who might target the foreign bride. Word of Ahab's controversial marriage had spread ahead of their arrival, generating excitement and opposition in equal measure. Samaria's population gathered in the streets when the royal caravan appeared on the horizon. Picture the crowd, thousands of people pressing forward to see their king's new wife. Children climbed trees for better views. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Farmers left their fields. The entire city buzzed with curiosity about the Phoenician princess who would become their queen. Ahab formally presented Jezebel to his people as his wife and Israel's new queen. The crowd applauded politely, but undercurrents of concern rippled through the assembly. Some whispered about the foreign woman who would influence their king. Others wondered what religious changes she might bring. A few voices expressed outright opposition to the marriage that violated Israel's religious traditions. Then a figure emerged from the crowd that would haunt Jezebel's dreams for years to come. Elijah the prophet appeared with the authority of divine commission burning in his eyes. 1 Kings 17:1 records his fearless confrontation. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. There shall not be dew nor rain. Read those words again. Elijah was prophesying judgment against the idolatrous alliance that would bring drought and famine to the land. The prophet warned that God would not approve this union with pagan worship. His words cut through the festive atmosphere like a sword, declaring divine opposition to the marriage that prioritized political advantage over spiritual faithfulness. This wasn't diplomatic disagreement. This was prophetic condemnation backed by heaven's authority. Ahab ignored Elijah's warning and continued with wedding preparations. He had made his choice based on earthly calculations, refusing to consider heavenly consequences. Jezebel heard the prophecy but dismissed it with royal contempt. What power could one Hebrew prophet wield against the combined might of two kingdoms backed by Phoenician gods? The wedding ceremony proceeded in Samaria with magnificent public celebrations that lasted for days. They merged Israeli blessing traditions with Phoenician rituals, creating a religious hybrid that satisfied neither faith completely. Food and wine flowed freely. Musicians played, dancers performed. The entire city participated in festivities that marked Israel's spiritual compromise. Jezebel distributed expensive gifts to Israeli nobles, buying loyalty with Phoenician gold. She understood that political support required personal investment. Every gift was a down payment on future cooperation. Every smile was a deposit in a relationship bank that would pay dividends when she needed support for controversial policies. The Israeli court officially accepted Jezebel as queen alongside Ahab. Palace officials adjusted to serving a foreign monarch whose customs differed from Israeli traditions. Nobles learned to navigate the complex dynamics of a royal household, now influenced by Phoenician culture and religion. Elijah left the city after delivering his prophetic message, but his words lingered like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The prophet had spoken judgment, and heaven would enforce it through natural consequences that would test the faith of an entire nation. Jezebel immediately began adapting her new environment to accommodate her religious needs. She installed small altars in her private palace chambers where she could offer daily prayers to Baal and Astarte. But privacy wasn't enough for a woman who believed her gods deserved public recognition and worship. Jezebel gained a throne beside Ahab in the royal hall of Samaria, establishing herself not just as queen, but as co-ruler with equal authority in governmental decisions. Picture the transformation of Israel's royal court. Where once Hebrew advisors had gathered to seek wisdom from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, now Phoenician influence poisoned every consultation. Jezebel participated in all important meetings with Israeli counselors, her voice carrying the weight of royal decree. She didn't just attend these sessions, she dominated them, steering conversations toward policies that advanced her religious and political agenda. Her strategy began with generosity that masked manipulation. Jezebel distributed gifts throughout Samaria, precious jewelry to common women, fine fabrics to merchants, silver coins to laborers. The people began to associate their foreign queen with prosperity and kindness. They didn't understand that every gift was the investment in their spiritual corruption, every smile a down payment on their eventual apostasy from the true God. The nobility received more substantial favors in exchange for supporting her plans. Land grants for those who endorsed her religious policies, trade privileges for merchants who embraced Phoenician customs, military promotions for officers who demonstrated loyalty to the royal couple's expanding vision for Israel's future. This wasn't charity. It was systematic bribery designed to create a power base that would support her when resistance emerged. Then Jezebel made her most audacious move. She convinced Ahab to erect massive altars to Baal in the heart of Samaria itself. Think about what this meant. The capital city of God's chosen people would now house temples dedicated to pagan deities that demanded practices forbidden by divine law. This wasn't religious tolerance. This was spiritual invasion disguised as cultural accommodation. 1 Kings 16:32-33 records the devastating truth, and he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. More to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. Read that again. Ahab's spiritual compromise exceeded every previous act of rebellion in Israel's history. Ahab ordered the construction of elaborate temples for Baal and Asherah in the capital city. Israeli workers, the descendants of those who had built Solomon's temple to honor the true God, now labored to create worship centers for foreign demons. They used imported cedar wood from Lebanon, the same material that had adorned the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. The irony was devastating, God's people using their skills and God's creation to build monuments to rebellion. Jezebel imported priests from Sidon to serve in these new temples, establishing a complete religious infrastructure that could operate independently of Israeli spiritual leadership. These weren't just ceremonial positions. They were strategic appointments designed to create an alternative religious authority that could challenge the prophets and priests who remained faithful to the God of Israel. She persuaded the court to adopt Phoenician religious practices in their daily lives. Palace servants learned to offer morning prayers to Baal. Royal guards participated in evening rituals honoring Astarte. The administrative machinery of government became infected with pagan spirituality that influenced every policy decision and legal judgment. Crowds gathered to witness the rituals at the newly constructed altars, drawn by curiosity and the promise of divine favor. Jezebel promised abundant rains if they worshipped Baal as the god of fertility and storm. She guaranteed better harvests, increased prosperity, and protection from enemies for those who embraced these powerful foreign deities. The promises sounded reasonable to people who had struggled with drought and military threats. Some Israelis abandoned their ancestral faith entirely, convinced that Phoenician gods offered more immediate and tangible benefits than the invisible God of their fathers. They brought their children to participate in pagan ceremonies. They contributed their wealth to support temple operations. They became missionaries for spiritual rebellion within their own communities. Jezebel organized elaborate festival celebrations at the temples to attract more followers and demonstrate the supposed power of her gods. These events featured music, dancing, feasting, and sexual rituals that appealed to human appetites while corrupting spiritual sensibilities. The festivals became so popular that even faithful Israelis felt social pressure to participate or risk isolation from their communities. But not everyone accepted the religious transformation quietly. Prophets of God began speaking boldly against the pagan altars in Samaria, declaring divine judgment on the apostasy that was consuming the nation. These brave men proclaimed that Israel's covenant God would not tolerate competition from foreign demons, that the altars represented rebellion that demanded heavenly punishment. 1 Kings 18:4 reveals Jezebel's response to prophetic opposition. For it was so, when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, that Obadiah took 100 prophets, and hid them by 50 in a cave, and fed them with bread and water. Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord. She ordered systematic persecution of God's messengers, hunting them down like criminals and executing them for the crime of spiritual faithfulness. Ahab permitted Jezebel to control religious affairs throughout the kingdom, effectively abdicating his responsibility as Israel's spiritual leader. The king, who should have protected divine worship, instead authorized its destruction. The monarch, who should have defended God's prophets, instead enabled their murder. The economic benefits of the Phoenician alliance initially masked the spiritual costs. Trade with Sidon and Tyre increased dramatically, bringing wealth that seemed to validate the controversial marriage. Merchants prospered, royal treasuries filled, construction projects multiplied. The kingdom appeared to thrive under policies that prioritized commercial success over spiritual integrity. Jezebel taught Phoenician dances to the women of the Israeli court, introducing sensual movements that had originated in fertility rituals. Children in the palace learned stories about Baal and Astarte alongside traditional Hebrew histories, creating confusion about which gods deserved worship and obedience. Nobles competed fiercely for Jezebel's favor, understanding that royal approval translated into political advancement and economic opportunity. The court became a marketplace where spiritual compromise purchased earthly rewards. Those who embraced pagan practices gained influence. Those who maintained biblical faith found themselves marginalized and eventually eliminated. Israel prospered economically under the Phoenician alliance, but the prosperity came with a price that few recognized until it was too late. The nation was trading its spiritual birthright for material abundance, sacrificing its covenant relationship with God for temporary political and economic advantages. Jezebel ignored repeated warnings from faithful prophets about divine judgment, dismissing their messages as the complaints of religious extremists who couldn't adapt to changing times. She had seen her gods bring prosperity to Phoenicia. She expected the same results in Israel. The court adopted Phoenician clothing styles, customs, and social practices, becoming culturally indistinguishable from pagan nations. Multitudes participated in offering ceremonies at the altars, believing promises of prosperity through divine favor. Jezebel felt intoxicated by her success in converting an entire nation to follow her gods. The worship of Baal had spread beyond the palace walls into every corner of Israeli society, transforming a covenant nation into a pagan kingdom that rivaled Phoenicia itself in spiritual darkness. But what started as political accommodation was about to descend into depths of evil that would shock even hardened pagans. The daily rituals at Baal's temples involved elaborate ceremonial dances where worshippers moved their bodies in hypnotic rhythms designed to induce religious ecstasy. Picture these scenes, hundreds of people swaying to drum beats that echoed through Samaria's streets, their movements becoming increasingly frenzied as they sought to please their demanding deity. Incense burned constantly on the altars, filling the air with sweet smoke that masked the metallic scent of blood from animal sacrifices. Phoenician priests led these ceremonies with theatrical intensity, their voices rising and falling in ancient chants that claimed to channel divine power. Music dominated the temple atmosphere, drums, cymbals, flutes, and stringed instruments, creating soundscapes that overwhelmed rational thought and encouraged emotional surrender to spiritual forces that biblical writers identified as demonic. But the worship of Astarte introduced even more disturbing elements. Jezebel actively encouraged ritual prostitution as part of religious observance, transforming sexual immorality into sacred duty. Temple prostitutes, both male and female, served worshippers who believed that physical union with these sacred servants would ensure divine blessing on their crops, livestock, and business ventures. What God had designed for marriage covenant became perverted into religious commerce. The festivals often lasted entire nights, with participants drinking wine, consuming ritual foods, and engaging in sexual activities that violated every moral boundary established in Mosaic law. These weren't occasional celebrations. They became regular features of Israeli religious life, corrupting the moral fabric of a nation that had once been set apart for holiness. Then came practices so abhorrent that they defied comprehension. Sacrifices of human children began occurring in extreme rituals designed to demonstrate ultimate devotion to Baal. Think about this horror. Parents bringing their own sons and daughters to be burned alive on pagan altars. These weren't accidental deaths or unfortunate casualties of religious enthusiasm. They were deliberate murders disguised as spiritual offerings. Picture the scene. A father carrying his young son through crowds of worshippers toward an altar where flames already consumed wood and incense. The child's terrified cries mixing with chanting voices and musical instruments. The priest raising ceremonial knives while explaining that this sacrifice would ensure abundant rains and prosperous harvests. The moment when human love was overwhelmed by religious delusion, when parental protection yielded to spiritual deception, Jezebel not only permitted these child sacrifices, she endorsed them as demonstrations of proper devotion to divine authority. She understood that extreme religious commitment required extreme religious expression. If Baal demanded the lives of children, then faithful worshippers must provide those lives without hesitation or regret. The faithful prophets of God went into hiding to escape Jezebel's systematic persecution. These men, who had once proclaimed divine messages openly in city squares and palace courtyards, now lived in caves and wilderness areas, dependent on secret supporters who risked their own lives to provide food and protection. St. Kings 18:4 records that Obadiah hid 100 prophets in caves, feeding them bread and water while Jezebel's agents searched for them throughout the kingdom. But one prophet refused to hide. Elijah appeared in villages and marketplaces, warning people against abandoning the true God for worthless idols. He spoke with the authority of heaven itself, declaring that Israel's covenant relationship with the Almighty could not coexist with Baal worship. His message was simple and terrifying. Choose God or choose judgment, but understand that neutrality was impossible. 1 Kings 17:1 preserves Elijah's prophetic confrontation with Ahab. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. There shall not be dew nor rain these years. The prophet was announcing divine judgment in the form of devastating drought that would continue until Israel repented of its spiritual adultery. Ahab heard Elijah's warning, but continued supporting Jezebel's religious revolution. The king had invested too much political capital in the Phoenician alliance to abandon it because of prophetic threats. He believed that Baal's priests could counter any supernatural opposition from Israel's traditional God. The drought began immediately and persisted for years without any relief. Rivers that had flowed continuously for centuries dried to dust. Wells that had supplied villages for generations became empty holes. Crops withered in fields where farmers watched helplessly as their livelihoods disappeared under relentless sunshine and cloudless skies. Picture the landscape transformation. Green valleys turned brown, then grey, then the color of ash. Streams became rocky channels, marked only by smooth stones that had once been covered by flowing water. Trees shed their leaves out of season and stood like skeletons against the pitiless blue sky. Animals gathered around the few remaining water sources, competing desperately for moisture that sustained life. The people suffered intensifying famine as food supplies dwindled and water became more precious than gold. They searched frantically for water in empty wells, digging deeper into ground that yielded only dry earth. Mothers watched their children grow thin and weak. Farmers abandoned fields that could no longer sustain crops. Merchants found no goods to trade because production had virtually ceased. Ironically, Baal's priests intensified their rituals in desperate attempts to invoke rain from their storm god. They performed increasingly elaborate ceremonies, offering more expensive gifts, conducting longer chants, and demonstrating greater physical devotion through self-inflicted wounds. But their rituals failed completely. Baal remained silent while his supposed domain, the weather, defied every prayer and offering made in his honor. The failure of Baal's priests to end the drought exposed the powerlessness of Phoenician religion when confronted by the God of Israel. Think about the implications. These priests claimed to serve the deity who controlled storms and fertility, yet they couldn't produce a single cloud in 3 years of desperate intercession. Their credibility crumbled along with their failed promises. Jezebel refused to acknowledge that the drought might represent divine judgment on her religious policies. Instead, she blamed God's prophets for the catastrophe, claiming that their opposition to Baal had angered the storm god and caused him to withhold rain. She intensified her persecution of faithful Israelis, executing more prophets and hunting down anyone who suggested that the drought was punishment for apostasy. Meanwhile, God protected Elijah supernaturally during the years of famine. 1 Kings 17:2-6 records the remarkable provision. And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Get thee hence, and turn thee eastward, and hide thyself by the brook Cherith, that is before Jordan. And it shall be that thou shalt drink of the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed thee there. Ravens brought him bread and meat twice daily, while he drank from a stream that continued flowing despite the national drought. Ahab sent servants throughout neighboring countries searching for the prophet who had pronounced judgment on Israel. The king understood that Elijah held the key to ending the catastrophe, but he wanted to capture and silence the prophet rather than repent of the sins that had triggered divine wrath. As the drought intensified, even committed Baal worshippers began questioning the effectiveness of their imported religion. If these gods truly controlled weather and fertility, why couldn't they end a disaster that was destroying their supposed domain? Seeds of doubt began growing in minds that had been seduced by promises of prosperity through pagan worship. After 3 years of devastating drought, God commanded Elijah to confront Ahab again and propose a test that would settle the religious controversy definitively. The prophet planned a divine confrontation on Mount Carmel, where the power of Israel's God would be demonstrated publicly against the combined forces of Phoenician paganism. News of Elijah's challenge spread throughout the kingdom like wildfire. Everyone understood that this would be more than a religious debate. It would be a supernatural contest where the true God would reveal himself through unmistakable divine intervention. Jezebel prepared her prophets for the Mount Carmel confrontation. She selected 450 priests of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, her most experienced and powerful religious leaders who had demonstrated their devotion through years of faithful service to Phoenician deities. These weren't novice clergy or casual worshippers. They were professional intermediaries between the human and divine realms, men who had dedicated their lives to mastering the spiritual technologies that supposedly gave them access to supernatural power. Elijah issued his challenge with the authority of heaven itself. He summoned the people of Israel and all of Jezebel's prophets to Mount Carmel for a public demonstration that would settle the religious controversy once and for all. This wouldn't be a theological debate or philosophical discussion. It would be a supernatural contest where the true God would reveal himself through unmistakable divine intervention. Picture the scene as thousands gathered on Mount Carmel's slopes. Farmers abandoned their drought-stricken fields. Merchants closed their shops. Women brought children to witness what everyone understood would be a historic confrontation. The entire population of northern Israel seemed to converge on this mountain where their spiritual destiny would be decided in a single afternoon. The prophets of Baal constructed their altar with careful attention to ritual requirements. They arranged stones in patterns that honored their deity's preferences. They prepared a bull for sacrifice, cutting the meat and arranging it on wood that would burn if their god sent fire from heaven. Everything was done according to Phoenician religious protocol that had supposedly proven effective for centuries. Elijah built a separate altar dedicated to the God of Israel, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes descended from Jacob. But he wasn't content with standard procedures. He ordered that his altar be drenched with water, 4 barrels poured 3 times until water filled the trenches around the altar and soaked the wood completely. In a land devastated by 3 years of drought, this water represented precious liquid that could have sustained human life. Yet Elijah used it to make ignition humanly impossible. 1 Kings 18:26 records what happened when Baal's prophets began their intercession. And they took the bullock which was given them, and they dressed it, and called on the name of Baal from morning even until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor any that answered, and they leaped upon the altar which was made, from morning even until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, nor any that answered. Think about the desperation that drove these men to increasing extremes of religious performance. They danced around their altar with frenzied movements designed to attract divine attention. They shouted Baal's name with voices that grew hoarse from hours of continuous pleading. They performed ritual leaping that was supposed to demonstrate their devotion and commitment to their deity's service. When morning prayers failed to produce results, they intensified their efforts throughout the afternoon. 1 Kings 18:28 describes their escalating desperation. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out upon them. They cut themselves after their manner with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out upon them. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were self-mutilation practices designed to prove their sincerity through physical suffering. Picture the scene. 450 priests dancing, shouting, bleeding and pleading, while thousands of spectators watched in growing amazement. Hours passed without any response from Baal. No fire appeared, no voice answered, no supernatural intervention vindicated their religious system. The god who supposedly controlled storms and fertility remained completely silent during the greatest test of his alleged power. Elijah mocked their futile efforts with devastating sarcasm. 1 Kings 18:27 preserves his taunts. And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awaked. Perhaps he sleepeth and must be awaked. The prophet was suggesting that Baal was too busy, too distant, or too unconscious to help his desperate followers. The crowd observed this failure with growing understanding. These weren't random religious practitioners. They were Jezebel's elite spiritual representatives, her most powerful advocates for Phoenician religion. If they couldn't demonstrate Baal's power under these circumstances, then perhaps Baal possessed no power worth demonstrating. When the prophets of Baal had exhausted themselves through hours of futile effort, Elijah stepped forward with quiet confidence. He repaired the altar that had been broken down, arranged the sacrifice properly, and then called upon the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel to vindicate his name before the assembled multitude. 1 Kings 18:36-37 records his simple prayer, and it came to pass, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, let it be known this day that thou art God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Hear me, O Lord, hear me, that this people may know that thou art the Lord God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fire fell from heaven and consumed not only the sacrifice, but the wood, stones, dust, and water around the altar. The supernatural fire was so intense that it vaporized materials that normal flames couldn't affect. This wasn't gradual ignition, it was instantaneous incineration that demonstrated divine power beyond human comprehension. The multitude witnessed this display and responded with unanimous confession. 1 Kings 18:39 captures their reaction. "And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, 'The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God. The Lord, He is the God.'" The contest was over. The true God had revealed himself, and the false gods had been exposed as powerless impostors. Elijah immediately commanded the execution of Baal's prophets. This wasn't revenge. It was justice demanded by divine law against those who had led Israel into spiritual rebellion. The people obeyed, seizing the 450 false prophets and slaughtering them at the brook Kishon. Every advocate for Phoenician religion was eliminated in a single afternoon of righteous judgment. Then Elijah prayed for rain, and clouds appeared in the sky for the first time in 3 years. The prophet who had announced the drought now declared its end. Heavy rain fell across the land, ending the famine and restoring fertility to soil that had been parched beyond recognition. Ahab witnessed these events and rushed back to tell Jezebel everything that had happened on Mount Carmel. He described the failure of her prophets, the triumph of Elijah's God, and the execution of the religious leaders she had imported from Phoenicia. The report devastated more than her religious program. It destroyed her entire understanding of divine power and spiritual authority. Jezebel's fury exceeded all previous displays of royal anger. She had invested her identity in the supremacy of Phoenician religion. She had staked her political credibility on Baal's ability to deliver prosperity and protection. The Mount Carmel demonstration exposed her gods as fraudulent and her religious system as worthless deception. 1 Kings 19:1-2 records her immediate response. "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. If I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." She was threatening to murder the prophet within 24 hours. This wasn't an empty threat or political posturing. Jezebel had demonstrated her willingness to kill God's messengers through years of systematic persecution. Elijah understood that she possessed both the motivation and the means to carry out her promised revenge. Despite his recent triumph, the prophet fled immediately for the wilderness, fearing for his life. He traveled south into the desert and eventually hid in a cave on Mount Horeb, seeking divine protection from the queen who had sworn to destroy him. The man who had just witnessed God's overwhelming power now ran in terror from a woman's threats. Meanwhile, the rain that ended the drought brought relief to the general population, but didn't soften Ahab's heart towards spiritual truth. He continued governing as before, apparently unchanged by the supernatural demonstration he had personally witnessed. Time passed, and Ahab's attention turned to earthly desires that would trigger the next phase of his spiritual downfall. He noticed a beautiful vineyard near his palace that belonged to a man named Naboth. Picture this property, rows of carefully tended grapevines producing the finest fruit in the region, located so close to the royal residence that Ahab could see it from his palace windows. The vineyard represented generations of family labor, passed down from father to son as a sacred inheritance that connected Naboth to his ancestors and to the land God had given to Israel. 1 Kings 21, 2-3 records Ahab's approach to Naboth. And Ahab spake unto Naboth, saying, Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near unto my house, and I will give thee for it a better vineyard than it. Or if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money. And Naboth said to Ahab, The Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. The Lord forbid it me, that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee. Naboth's refusal wasn't stubbornness or disrespect. It was obedience to divine law that prohibited selling family land permanently. Leviticus 25:23 established the principle, The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me. The vineyard belonged to God, who had granted it to Naboth's family as their portion in the promised land. Selling it would violate sacred trust and abandon his children's rightful inheritance, but Ahab couldn't accept this refusal. 1 Kings 21:4 describes his response, And Ahab came into his house heavy and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he had said, I will not give thee the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid him down upon his bed, and turned away his face, and would eat no bread. So he laid him down upon his bed, and turned away his face, and would eat no bread. The king of Israel was sulking like a spoiled child who couldn't have his favorite toy. Think about this scene. The monarch who commanded armies and controlled national resources was lying on his bed pouting because one citizen refused to sell his family property. Ahab had wealth, power, and authority over an entire kingdom, yet he was devastated by this single rejection of his desires. Jezebel found her husband in this pathetic condition and demanded an explanation. When Ahab described Naboth's refusal to sell the vineyard, she responded with contempt for his weakness and confidence in her ability to solve the problem through methods he apparently lacked the stomach to employ. Art thou now governing Israel? She asked mockingly. The question revealed her true opinion of Ahab's leadership capabilities and her own willingness to exercise royal power more ruthlessly than he dared. She promised to obtain the vineyard for him through techniques that wouldn't require Naboth's cooperation or consent. Jezebel devised a conspiracy that demonstrated her mastery of political manipulation and judicial corruption. She wrote official letters in Ahab's name, using his royal seal to authenticate documents that would appear to come directly from the king himself. These weren't hasty notes. They were carefully crafted legal instruments designed to accomplish murder through legitimate governmental processes. The letters commanded city leaders in Naboth's hometown to proclaim a fast and conduct a public trial where Naboth would be accused of blasphemy against God and treason against the crown. 1 Kings 21:8-10 preserves the specific instructions. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters unto the elders and to the nobles that were in his city, dwelling with Naboth. And she wrote in the letters, saying, Proclaim a fast, and set Naboth on high among the people, and set 2 men, sons of Belial, before him, to bear witness against him, saying, Thou didst blaspheme God and the king. 2 men, sons of Belial, were hired to provide false testimony that would result in Naboth's execution. These weren't random witnesses. They were professional liars willing to commit perjury in exchange for payment or royal favor. The plan exploited Israel's legal requirement for 2 witnesses to establish guilt in capital cases, using legitimate judicial procedures to accomplish illegitimate purposes. The city leaders received these letters and obeyed without question, demonstrating how thoroughly royal authority could corrupt local governance when exercised by those who prioritized power over justice. They proclaimed the fast, assembled the population, and conducted the trial exactly as Jezebel had commanded. Picture the scene in Naboth's city. Citizens gathered expecting a day of religious observance and community prayer. Instead, They witnessed a show trial where their respected neighbor was accused of crimes that demanded death penalties. The two false witnesses delivered their rehearsed accusations with convincing detail, claiming they had heard Naboth curse God and speak treason against King Ahab. The crowd believed these fabricated testimonies and responded with righteous anger against what they perceived as genuine blasphemy and sedition. They dragged Naboth outside the city walls and stoned him to death, believing they were executing divine justice when they were actually committing judicial murder orchestrated by their queen. Messengers immediately reported Naboth's death to Jezebel, who received the news with cold satisfaction. Her plan had succeeded perfectly. The obstacle to Ahab's desires had been eliminated through legal processes that left no trace of royal complicity. She told her husband to take possession of the vineyard since its owner was now dead and couldn't protest the confiscation. Ahab went to the vineyard and claimed it as royal property, walking among the grapevines that had cost an innocent man his life. He should have felt guilt or remorse, but instead he felt satisfaction at finally obtaining the property he had coveted. The vineyard that Naboth had died to protect now belonged to the king who had enabled his murder. But God had witnessed this conspiracy and would not allow it to go unpunished. He sent Elijah to confront Ahab in the very vineyard where the king was celebrating his ill-gotten acquisition. 1 Kings 21:17-19 records the divine message, "And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Arise, go down to meet Ahab king of Israel, which is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, whither he is gone down to possess it. And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, Hast thou killed and also taken possession? And thou shalt speak unto him, saying, Thus saith the Lord, In the place where dogs licked the blood of Naboth shall dogs lick thy blood, even thine." Elijah found Ahab walking through Naboth's vineyard, inspecting his new property with royal satisfaction. The prophet delivered God's judgment with devastating directness. "Hast thou killed and also taken possession?" The question pierced through all legal pretenses to expose the moral reality. Ahab was a murderer and a thief who had used royal authority to commit crimes that demanded divine retribution. The prophecy was specific and terrifying. Dogs would lick Ahab's blood in the same place where they had licked Naboth's blood. Jezebel would be devoured by dogs near the walls of Jezreel. Their entire dynasty would be eliminated because of the evil they had committed against innocent people and the God they had rejected. 1 Kings 21:20-24 preserves the complete judgment. "And Ahab said to Elijah, Hast thou found me, O mine enemy? And he answered, I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring evil upon thee, and will take away thy posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel, and will make thine house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, for the provocation wherewith thou hast provoked me to anger, and made Israel to sin. And of Jezebel also spake the Lord, saying, The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." When Ahab heard this prophetic condemnation, he was overcome with fear and apparent remorse. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted, traditional expressions of repentance and mourning for sin. His response seemed genuine enough that God postponed the immediate execution of judgment, though the ultimate consequences would still fall upon his family. But Jezebel showed no such repentance when she learned of Elijah's prophecy. Instead, she mocked the prophet's words and dismissed them as empty threats from a powerless religious fanatic. She had survived the Mount Carmel catastrophe and the execution of her priests. She had successfully orchestrated Naboth's murder and secured the vineyard for Ahab. In her mind, she remained the dominant force in Israeli politics, untouchable by divine judgment or human opposition. Years passed, and Ahab made a decision that would fulfill Elijah's prophecy in precise detail. He chose to go to war against the Arameans at Ramoth-Gilead, allying himself with Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, for this military campaign. The alliance seemed strategically sound. Two kingdoms combining their armies against a common enemy that threatened both nations. 400 false prophets encouraged Ahab with unanimous predictions of easy victory. They promised divine blessing on the campaign and assured him that Ramoth-Gilead would fall quickly to the combined Israeli-Judean forces. These weren't God's messengers. They were court prophets who told kings what they wanted to hear in exchange for royal favor and financial support. But one true prophet remained in Israel. Micaiah was summoned to give his assessment of the military campaign, and his message contradicted everything the false prophets had promised. 1 Kings 22:17 records his vision, and he said, "I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills, as sheep that have not a shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master, let them return every man to his house in peace." These have no master. Micaiah was prophesying that Ahab would die in battle, leaving Israel without a king. Ahab heard this warning but chose to ignore it, trusting instead in military strategy and false prophecies that promised success. He had rejected divine guidance too many times to accept it now, even when it came through a prophet whose accuracy had been proven repeatedly. In the battle, Ahab disguised himself to avoid being recognized by enemy forces who would specifically target the Israeli king. He wore common armor instead of royal regalia, hoping to fight anonymously among his soldiers while still commanding the army's movements. But divine judgment cannot be evaded through human cunning. 1 Kings 22:34 records the moment of destiny, and a certain man drew a bow at a venture and smote the king of Israel between the joints of the harness. Wherefore he said unto the driver of his chariot, Turn thine hand and carry me out of the host, for I am wounded. A certain man drew a bow at a venture. The arrow was shot randomly, without specific aim, yet it found the one gap in Ahab's armor that would prove fatal. Ahab bled in his chariot throughout the remainder of that day, watching his army fight while his life slowly drained away. When the sun set, the king who had defied God for decades finally died. His body was brought back to Samaria for burial, and when servants washed his chariot, dogs licked his blood exactly as Elijah had prophesied years earlier. The king received a royal funeral in Samaria, but his death left Israel vulnerable and unstable. Jezebel learned of her husband's death and immediately moved to consolidate her political influence over the succession. She intensified pagan sacrifices at Baal and Asherah altars, using religious ceremony to maintain her authority during the transition of power. Ahaziah, Ahab's son, assumed the throne and continued his mother's religious policies without question. He had learned idolatry from childhood and saw no reason to abandon practices that had defined his family's reign. But his rule lasted only 2 years before he fell through a lattice in his palace chamber and suffered injuries that left him bedridden. Instead of seeking healing from the God of Israel, Ahaziah sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, about his recovery prospects. 2 Kings 1:2 records his faithless decision, and Ahaziah fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria, and was sick. And he sent messengers, and said unto them, Go, inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease. Elijah intercepted these messengers and prophesied that Ahaziah would die without recovering from his fall. The king died exactly as predicted, leaving the throne to his brother Jehoram, who continued the family's pattern of spiritual compromise while making minor adjustments to his predecessor's policies. Jezebel remained the power behind the throne through these rapid successions. She had outlived her husband and watched one son die from a fall, but her influence over royal policy never wavered. The Queen Mother continued to shape religious practices, political decisions, and court culture, with the same iron will that had corrupted Israel for decades. Her network of supporters, accumulated wealth, and intimate knowledge of governmental operations made her virtually untouchable, despite the prophetic warnings that hung over her family. But God's patience with the house of Ahab was finally exhausted. Divine judgment would no longer be delayed by royal repentance or political maneuvering. The instrument of retribution was already being prepared through supernatural intervention that would sweep away every remnant of Jezebel's poisonous legacy. 2 Kings 9:1-6 records how God initiated the final phase of judgment, and Elisha the prophet called one of the children of the prophets and said unto him, Gird up thy loins and take this box of oil in thine hand and go to Ramoth-Gilead. And when thou comest thither, look out there Jehu the son of Jehoshaphat, the son of Nimshi, and go in, and make him arise up from among his brethren, and carry him to an inner chamber. Then take the box of oil, and pour it upon his head, and say, Thus saith the Lord, I have anointed thee king over Israel. A young prophet found Jehu among the military officers at Ramoth-Gilead, and secretly anointed him as Israel's new king. The anointing wasn't a public ceremony, it was a clandestine commissioning for revolution that would topple the existing dynasty and establish divine justice through human agency. Jehu received explicit instructions to destroy the house of Ahab and execute judgment on Jezebel for her crimes against innocent blood. Jehu immediately gathered his loyal military captains and revealed his divine commission. These weren't random soldiers. They were experienced commanders who understood the spiritual corruption that had infected Israel under Ahab's family. They recognized that political change required military action, and they pledged their support for the divinely ordained coup that would cleanse the nation. Picture the scene as Jehu's forces traveled swiftly toward Jezreel, where King Jehoram was recovering from wounds received in battle against the Syrians. The thundering hooves of horses and chariot wheels announced the approach of men who carried heaven's warrant for execution. This wasn't a leisurely royal procession, it was urgent movement toward a divine appointment with justice. Watchmen on Jezreel's walls spotted the approaching company and alerted King Jehoram. The king sent messengers to determine whether Jehu came in peace or war, but those messengers never returned. Kings 9-18-19 records what happened. So there went one on horseback to meet him and said, Thus saith the king, Is it peace? And Jehu said, What hast thou to do with peace? Turn thee behind me. And the watchman told, saying, The messenger came to them, but he cometh not again. 3. The messengers joined Jehu's company rather than reporting back to their king, a sign that royal authority was already crumbling before the divinely appointed revolutionary. Jehoram finally came out personally in his chariot to meet Jehu, accompanied by Ahaziah, king of Judah, who happened to be visiting during his recovery. The confrontation occurred in the field that had once belonged to Naboth, the vineyard for which an innocent man had died and which had triggered the prophetic curse on Ahab's family. Divine justice was about to come full circle in the exact location where royal corruption had reached its murderous climax. Kings 9:21-24 preserves the moment of execution. And Joram said, Make ready, and his chariot was made ready. And Joram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah, king of Judah, went out, each in his chariot, and they went out against Jehu, and met him in the portion of Naboth, the Jezreelite. And it came to pass, when Joram saw Jehu, that he said, Is it peace, Jehu? And he answered, What peace, so long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many? And Joram turned his hands and fled, and said to Ahaziah, There is treachery, O Ahaziah. And Jehu drew a bow with his full strength, and smote Jehoram between his arms, and the arrow went out at his heart, and he sunk down in his chariot. Jehu shot Jehoram through the heart with a single arrow, ending the reign of Ahab's second son in the same field where his family's crimes had begun. The king, who had inherited his mother's spiritual corruption, died violently in the place that symbolized royal injustice and divine judgment. Jehu commanded his men to throw Jehoram's body into Naboth's former field, fulfilling the prophetic word that the family responsible for innocent blood would pay with their own blood in the same location. The corpse of the king lay where the vineyard owner had been murdered, completing a circle of divine retribution that had been decades in the making. Then Jehu drove furiously toward Jezreel to confront the architect of Israel's spiritual destruction. Jezebel heard reports of her son's death and understood that her own time had come, but she would not go quietly into the judgment that had been pronounced against her years earlier by Elijah. 2 Kings 9:30 describes her final preparations. And when Jehu was come to Jezreel, Jezebel heard of it, and she painted her face and tired her head and looked out at a window. She painted her face and tired her head. Even facing imminent death, Jezebel maintained the royal dignity and seductive beauty that had been her primary weapons throughout a lifetime of manipulation and murder. Picture this final scene. The queen who had corrupted a nation standing at her palace window, makeup applied with royal precision, hair arranged in elaborate style. She wasn't cowering in fear or begging for mercy. She was facing her executioner with the same proud defiance that had characterized her entire reign. When Jehu arrived below her window, Jezebel called out with contempt, "Had Zimri peace, who slew his master?" She was comparing Jehu to Zimri, another military officer who had assassinated a king but ruled only 7 days before being destroyed himself. Her taunt suggested that Jehu's revolution would be as short-lived as previous coups. But Jehu ignored her words and looked up to the palace servants watching from nearby windows. 2 Kings 9:32-33 records his command and their response. And he lifted up his face to the window and said, "Who is on my side? Who?" And there looked out to him 2 or 3 eunuchs. And he said, "Throw her down." So they threw her down, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the wall and on the horses, and he trode her underfoot. The eunuchs who had served Jezebel for years immediately betrayed her when offered the opportunity to join the winning side. They threw her from the high window without hesitation, ending her life with the same cold efficiency she had used to destroy others. Jezebel's broken body hit the ground where Jehu's horses trampled it under their hooves. The woman who had terrorized prophets and murdered innocent people died brutally in the courtyard of her own palace, her blood spattering the walls and stones where she had once commanded absolute obedience. Jehu entered the palace and calmly ate a meal while Jezebel's corpse lay outside. Only after satisfying his hunger did he remember that she had been a king's daughter who deserved royal burial despite her crimes. 2 Kings 9:34-37 records the final fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy. And when he was come in, he did eat and drink and said, "Go, see now this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." And they went to bury her, but they found no more of her than the skull and the feet and the palms of her hands. Wherefore they came again and told him. And he said, "This is the word of the Lord which he spake by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the portion of Jezreel shall dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the portion of Jezreel, so that they shall not say, This is Jezebel." Dogs had devoured Jezebel's body, leaving only skull, feet, and palms, exactly as Elijah had prophesied decades earlier. If this incredible story of Jezebel touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing biblical stories. Click the video showing on your screen now. God bless you and see you next time.